Chapter 19, Intellectual and Cultural Trends in the Late 19th Century. So in this chapter, we will be looking at the lives of scholars, pretty much. And this is not a majority of the population. This is a small percentage of the population, but they were wildly influential and still are. So we're going to look at how more people began to attend colleges and universities, the revolution in the social sciences, how art and literature began to change, and how this was happening in the late 1800s. So we'll look first at the increase in attendance at colleges and universities. The number of colleges in the late 1890s began to increase as state universities and co-educational land-grant colleges began to spring up across the nation. And it's important to remember that this is still less than 2% of the college-age population who are attending college. So a very small minority of people are pursuing higher education. And it was really Harvard that led the way in bringing changes to the curriculum and even professionalizing college training and making magazines and new curriculum available for professors and teachers. Johns Hopkins University was established in 1876, and it was modeled on German universities. And really, it was Johns Hopkins that pioneered the modern research university and professional graduate education in America. We also began to see women attend college, and this began with Vassar and some notable alumni: Meryl Streep, Anne Hathaway, Phoebe from Friends, Lisa Kudrow, Jane Fonda, Jackie Onassis Kennedy actually went there as well, but they pioneered the establishment of women's colleges and led to the further establishment of other women's colleges. But even within college life, the scene began to change. Alumni influence grew on campus. There were more and more fraternities. Organized sports became a popular part of the college scene, and really colleges and universities mirrored the complexities of modern American society. And industrialization had forever changed the way Americans thought, and it changed the way institutions of higher education educated students, as did Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And of course, he influenced philosophers, historians, lawyers, professors, and so on. So at the same time that college attendance is increasing, there was also a revolution in social sciences, and just namely like sociology, political science, economics, as those fields of science tried to address the problems of those days. Social scientists began to try to apply the theory of evolution to every aspect of human relations. And we've talked about social Darwinism, where the person who is the most well off will survive and reproduce, and those who are not well off, those who live in poor conditions and in poverty, will continue to live that way until they eventually die off, pretty much. Social scientists also attempted to use science to try to find objective truths. But the problem was that they were trying to find objective truths in subjective fields. A lot of times with sociology and economics and political science, there's not an objective truth, really. But they attempted to use science to try to find them in these fields. Controversies over trusts and the conditions in the slums and other problems facing society during this time drew scholars into practical affairs, and they wanted to try to use sociology and political science and economics to try to solve practical problems. Progressive education began to make its way to the forefront of society as educators began to realize that traditional education just was not working, and it was not preparing students for life in industrial America. And I think even most educators realized that a large majority of the school population would wind up working in a factory. And it was really, this idea sort of began with the settlement house workers. And we talked, I think, in the last chapter about settlement houses, which were usually founded by Protestant do-gooders who wanted to help women and children and families who were living in the slums. And settlement house workers found that slum children needed training, not necessarily in science and math, but in handicrafts, in citizenship, in personal hygiene, as much as they needed training in reading and writing. And so this new idea emerged, progressive education, and these theorists argue that good teaching called for professional training, psychological insights, enthusiasm, imagination, and not just corporal punishment and rote memorization. And really the forerunner of this movement was a guy named John Dewey, and you'll see his name whenever you look at progressive education. You will definitely see his name. And he came out of the University of Chicago as the leading proponent of this kind of education. And really his idea was simple. He believed that the school should be an embryonic community, almost like a mirror of society at large, just a smaller, more condensed version of regular American society. And he believed that that would best prepare students for going out into the world. Dewey believed that education should center around the child, and that new information should relate to what the child already knows. In other words, find what the child is already good at and help them become better in that field. And Dewey saw schools as instruments of reform. And toward that end, he argued that education should definitely teach citizenship, should teach values, and should pretty much just teach students how to be good American citizens. In the late 1890s, social evolutionists also affected the way people viewed law and history. And this is really well reflected in the writing of Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1881. His work was called The Common Law. And it best summarized this new view that the necessities of the time should determine the rules by which people were governed. Not tradition, not precedent, not the examples that were just set before, but the necessities of the time. And so he was perpetuating this idea that the laws should not just change all over the place, but should change a little bit to reflect what is going on in society at that time. Holmes' views didn't really initiate a reversal of judicial practice, and his most notable opinions usually tended to be dissents. But his ideas did reflect 19th century thought, and they began to gain influence throughout the 20th century as well. Historians began to respond to these new intellectual trends as well. There were political historians who began to trace documented evidence to discover the roots of American democracy, the evolutionary development of their current political institutions. Basically, they wanted to trace the genealogy of democracy and then look at how it developed in America. And one of the products of this new approach was the theory of Teutonic origins. And I'll spell this word. The theory of Teutonic origins of democracy. And this has since then been thoroughly discredited. But it just argues that the origins of democracy could be first found in the ancient tribes of Northern Europe. In the same line of thinking, there was also the frontier thesis, which was produced by Frederick Jackson Turner. And he argued that the frontier experience had definitely shaped the thinking and the institutions of the American people, particularly the individualism and the democratic character of the Americans. And this one has also been discounted because historians believe that Turner way overemphasized the democracy in frontier life, and he was also unable to explain American development as completely as his theory said it did. Even though these historians' theories were discounted, and many others were as well, they emphasized objectivity, exactitude, and they put into place scholarly standards that benefited the profession. Probably the best work of this time was Henry Adams' 9-volume History of the United States during the administrations of Jefferson and Adams. And with all of this, you really just begin to see the rise in standards. When writing histories or when looking at laws, they began to use objectivity and to try to look at all sides of a situation without just inserting biases. Realism in literature. The majority of America's pre-Gilded Age literature was romantic in mood. And you really see the styles come and go here, because we talked about Romanticism, how it was partly a rejection of 17th century realism. And you really see this cycle come back with industrialism, the theories of evolution, the practical side of social sciences, the complexities of modern life, really produced a change in American literature. And novelists began to look at real things, real social problems, like the conditions of the slums, political corruption, and many of them looking at the struggle between labor and capital. And probably the best example of this type of writing was produced by Mark Twain. And probably no man pursued modern materialism with more vigor than Samuel Clemens. But at the same time, no man could illustrate the follies of the American post-Civil War age or the American Gilded Age with greater exactitude than his alter ego, Mark Twain. His keen wit, his American sense of humor, his eye for detail, really allowed him to portray the best and the worst of his age. And his works provide, of course, a brilliant and biting insight into the society of his day. And he's, of course, probably most well known for The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But he also wrote The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, and The Innocents Abroad, and did a really good job of portraying the evils of the Gilded Age. And we will leave off there, and we'll pick up tomorrow with William Dean Howells.